Yep.
We could grab some other chairs if you'd prefer.
No, I think we're fine.
No?
Plus, the microphone's pretty directional, so.
Sure. Okay.
Um, let's begin.
Cool.
Keeping in mind that the film is going to be shown to an American audience uninitiated in New Zealand politics, could you briefly explain what the Green Party is and what its policies are?
Sure. We're a party we established in 1990, grew out of a party that was called Values, which was established in 1972. The Values Party had some success electorally in the sense that they drew quite a number of votes, never succeeded in getting an electorate seat. On the first past the post, of course, that made them effectively powerless. The Green Party established in 1990 four primary pillars or principles, which is environmental justice, social justice, appropriate decision making and non-violence, and similar principles to the Green Parties internationally.
And how much influence do third parties have in MMP?
Potentially a great deal, sometimes almost in excess of their numbers. The last several elections, in fact since we've had MMP in New Zealand, all of the outcomes of the elections have been determined, that is the makeup of the governments, have been determined by one of the older, larger parties making some sort of deal with one or more smaller parties.
Do you believe that having a party to the left of Labour on social issues has freed Labour to move more to the centre on social issues, or has support for the Greens pressured them to adopt more progressive policies?
A little bit of both, I think. Certainly the Greens feel that we've managed to green Labour in terms of its environmental policy. Arguably having parties to the left of Labour socially has at least highlighted the difference and perhaps provided a venue for the more leftward leaning people to vote, to express their opinion, their position. Labour historically, of course, was a party of the left that started from a very strongly socialist perspective, but that has certainly moved towards the centre in the last 20 years particularly.
Do you think they've changed from National and Labour? Do you think they've changed from more broad spectrum parties to narrower parties under MMP, or are they still like the Big Ten parties?
They're still quite inclusive, but what it has allowed is for some of the factions, for example New Labour, which grew out of the Labour Party, there was a splinter group out of the old Labour Party, named themselves New Labour, which became one of the primary members of the alliance, which formed as an alliance of small parties in order to contest the first MMP election in '96. The Labour Party effectively removed its more radical wing in that sense, enabled it to become somewhat less factional than it had been historically, sure.
And would you say that when people vote in MMP, are they voting more for the people in the party, the leadership, or are they voting more for the policies of the party, or the general academic ideas?
I suspect that this is a broad generalisation, obviously, but I think probably the people voting for the traditional two parties, Labour and National, would tend to vote more for the package, for the party. A lot of that's about loyalties, historic loyalties, and just an overall perception that Labour or National is right for that person. I believe that the people voting for the smaller parties are typically more motivated by policy, to some extent by individuals. One of our small parties, New Zealand First, is very much a populist party. It's all about the leader, Winston Peters. So his support, that party's support primarily depends on the personality of that one person. But again, as a generalisation, I think small party voters are about an ethical position, a policy position, a set of beliefs, rather than a more of an historic attachment with the old parties.
Anything we need? Okay. Back in the 1980s, or rather, you did a lot for, as from what I could remember, you did a lot of campaigning for MMP back in the 1990s, correct?
Personally, not a great deal. As part of the Green Party, certainly. The Electoral Reform Coalition was the prime mover of the movement to get electoral change. There was a Royal Commission in 1986 which came out quite surprisingly with some quite radical suggestions that we needed a new electoral system. And the Electoral Reform Coalition, Rod Donald, our late great leader of the Greens, and a woman called Helen, who I believe you'll be speaking to later in the week, were prime movers within that movement. And it picked up a lot of the social movement, women's, generally just about any social movement interested in democracy was pro-MMP, simply because the old first past the post was inherently undemocratic.
Why MMP and not, say, single transferable vote like they have in Ireland or I believe Australia?
Indeed. That was a recommendation of the Commission. STV is inherently, again, it is more powerfully democratic than MMP, but maybe it was a step too far for New Zealand at that time. MMP is more readily explained. STV is somewhat complex. It is a somewhat more fundamental shift and would have been a much more difficult sell. In a sense, MMP was a compromise position. It was way more democratic than anything we'd had before, and it was saleable. People could understand it quite readily, absorb it, see where the power would lie, and so the decision was to go for what was achievable rather than to go for the ultimate outcome or the preferred outcome, arguably.
Would you say that there is more or less or the same amount of skepticism in politics or of politics from first past the post to MMP? Actually, let me re-ask that because I totally messed that up. Would you say that how would you compare popular skepticism in the political process in the 1980s under first past the post compared to today under mixed member proportional?
There is still a high level of skepticism about politics and politicians particularly, but I think qualitatively it has changed. Prior to MMP, there was a fundamental loss of trust in the electoral process and the political process in New Zealand. We'd had a number of examples of parties campaigning on a platform, notably the Labour Party in 1984, campaigned very hard on a set of amendments, of reforms, and then came and did things that were completely unexpected, deregulated the economy, substantially changed social services, eliminated economic subsidies for our key productive sectors and so on, caused a significant loss of trust in the whole political system. And I think we regained some of that with MMP. At least now people do feel they have an ounce of influence over the outcome. By voting for smaller parties, there is an option and there is an opportunity to influence the overall shape of the policy agenda in a given term.
So, just to sum up, would it be accurate to say that even though people are still skeptical of the politicians, they're less skeptical of the political system?
I believe so, yes, in the sense that people do now see that small parties are able to assert a degree of influence, and small parties, for the most part, and I certainly count the Greens amongst this, have been sensible enough to use their power wisely, not to try and demand too much. The Greens got 5-6% of the vote, and we try and assert a level of pressure that is appropriate to that vote, to that base.
Do you believe MMP has made politicians more accountable or less accountable to the public?
Personally, I believe it's made politicians more accountable. Some people would have it that the parties carry too much pressure. Again, the Greens are somewhat unique in that we rank our party list, and therefore we determine which of our members become politicians by a popular vote of the whole membership. Where parties rank their list by committee or by the leadership making those decisions, then arguably the parties are gaining more power at the expense of the electorates. It's very much about the internal democracy within parties, I think.
And how is campaigning and electioneering, the tactics involved, has that changed under MMP?
Very much so. Clearly for the new parties, for the smaller parties, it's all about party vote. It's all about putting that message out there that by giving party X your party vote, that you'll have an ability to have an influence on what happens over the next 3-year term. Previously, it was very much about an ideology, Labour for the workers, National for the property owners and the business people and the rural community. Very roughly that was the split. It's become more complex, somewhat more sophisticated, and New Zealanders are still learning how to make MMP work for them. New Zealanders are starting to become strategic voters in a way that we haven't been before, I think. For example, in the last election, the Greens lost a level of support from what we call the soft Labour Green vote. People who have some sympathy for the Greens and our policy, But when it seemed that the Greens and National were neck and neck, they reverted to voting for Labour rather than see a national government come in. There is a degree of sophistication evolving, but it is still relatively untried, and it's new. It's despite having been around for over a decade now.
That actually seemed kind of weird to me that the Labour Green soft voters under MMP wouldn't the natural thing. I know it didn't happen, but wouldn't the natural inclination would have been that Labour could have voted for, or rather, Labour could have allied with the Greens and formed a coalition?
That was certainly our expectation, if not coalition, at least a close level, perhaps confidence and supply vote, some quite close arrangement up to and including coalition. We were as surprised as anyone when Labour chose to go with two much more centrist, even right-wing parties. That clearly it's all about numbers, it's about adding up and knowing how many votes are available to you. Labour decided to go with what it believed was a safer option, which was United Future and New Zealand First, rather than the risk, the perceived risk of relying on a combination of Green and Māori Party votes. I believe that there was nervousness about the Māori Party, though we knew some of their MPs have a history of radicalism. In fact, they've proven to be very stable, very hard-working, very sensible MPs. But I think there was that perception of risk, and Labour took the safer option, I believe.
There was also the idea that New Zealand First, that Winston Peters had promised that he'd form an alliance with, or form a coalition with, the party that got the most votes first.
Yes, that's right.
And Labour just edged out. I believe it was 41 to 40. Do you think that affected tactically those soft voters who were on the edge between Labour and Green?
I think the sense was more that I think that soft vote very much defaulted back to Labour. It was a very close run election, as you know. It seemed that National had made a major resurgent, and there was a major concern within Labour voters, historic Labour supporters. It was very much a tribal thing, I think, that they went back to the fold rather than run the perceived risk of losing support. One's always tempted to blame the media for everything, but I think one major problem with MMP, an issue we need to resolve and deal with, is to get media reporting which reflects the reality of an MMP contest. Even to this day, if you look at the news today, the last week, the last month, all the reference to the polling, to the position of the parties, looks at Labour and National. Some of the more sophisticated journalists are looking at possible coalitions, formations, but primarily throughout the election campaigns, the media are focusing on the battle between the two main parties as if that was the race. And in fact, we know it isn't. It's about who gets a majority in total in the parliament rather than any single party.
Do you think there's more political participation in New Zealand now with MMP?
In fact, no. The participation in voting has declined. We historically had a very, very high level of participation, despite the fact that voting is not, one's not obliged to vote in New Zealand. We are obliged legally to be on the roll, but whether or not you vote on the day is entirely voluntary. The trend has been a diminished turnout. Part of that, I think, is generational, younger people who don't actually see the point of politics, they're not politically engaged. And my analysis of that personally is that the significant shift to the right in the 1980s and 90s, the messages a lot of younger people have grown up with is about look after oneself, look after your own interests, you're out there for number one, much more independent, less community-minded, and for that reason I believe fewer younger people are participating in voting. At the other end, you're getting people who have simply become confused or disillusioned with the whole process. Māori voters tend to be relatively low participants. In fact, that did change last election with the emergence of the Māori Party, but overall there has been a trend to less participation rather than more.
In the United States, the Green Party can't even get enough support to get on the ballot in some states. Why is the Green Party comparatively, well, compared to the United States at least, more effective in New Zealand?
I think in part at least, it's the nature of the electoral system. Any party, anybody can create a party. If you get 500 registered members, you can put candidates up in an election. You don't have to go through the the same level or the same number of hurdles as the Americans do. We're unique, I think, in a Western liberal democracies. We're a unicameral country. We have one House of Parliament. There's no upper house, there's no Senate, there's no House of Lords as they have in UK. So it's quite critical that our Parliament gets it right. MMP does put a much higher level of democracy into our Parliament. It requires not just one party to be persuaded, but numerous parties to be persuaded before a piece of legislation can pass. The Greens bring a flavour to Parliament that hasn't been there before. Everything we do from the ground up is looking at not only today, but also the future, looking at human wants and needs, but also the quality of environment, the life of the planet. Not Parliament through MMP, I think, has made us relevant in the political context. We've got some traction over the last 9 years, and we've proven that we can be quite a stable and unifying force in Parliament.
Are there any particular social policies that the Greens have brought forward that eventually became established as law that wouldn't have been if we were still talking about if New Zealand was still in a first past the post system?
The most recent example of that is the infamous Section 59. Section 59 of the Crimes Act meant that an adult who struck a child physically, particularly a parent striking a child, could use the fact of that relationship as a reason not to be charged with assault. And the Greens put up a members' bill to have that section eliminated from the Crimes Act, so that if I strike a child, be it my own or somebody else's, I can be charged as if I struck you or another adult. The Greens pushed that, and we took some political hits on that. People saw it as being too interventionist, that it was nanny state, that it was about political correctness. But in fact, we had documented examples where people had used that section of the Crimes Act to defend themselves successfully against beating children with pieces of wood and electric cords, which is just completely unacceptable in a modern society. So that's the most recent example of a very successful social policy that would not have gone ahead without the Greens.
New Zealand has a reputation as a very beautiful country with a very nice environment. Do you think that the Green Party is responsible for a lot of that, for helping preserve that? I messed that question up a lot. Would you say that basically that New Zealand's reputation as environmentally very proactive and very beautiful, natural preservationist internationally, do you think the Green Party has had a lot to do with how, with the policies that have brought about that opinion?
The Greens have certainly been a major contributor to that. The broader Green movement, at least since the 70s, the protest movement, the environmental movement, the conservation movement, even civil rights movements have all allied to protect the quality of life, the quality of the environment we have. The Greens have provided significant leadership, clearly, in the political domain, which is we see ourselves very much as the political wing of the broader Green movement, and work very hard to maintain good relationships with, as I've said, the environmental, the social activists, the more progressive elements. In a sense, the Greens have also been responsible for shining a light on the fact that the New Zealand's clean and green image is still only an image. It's not as real as we might wish it to be. We are still polluting, we are still diminishing the quality of our waterways, we're still clearing land in situations where arguably we ought not to. So to some extent we're trying to realise the image of New Zealand as a clean green country.
Could you tell me a little bit about the Electoral Reform Commission?
Electoral Reform Coalition?
Coalition.
Yep.
I've got that mistake all throughout the notes, and I just know it as the ERC.
Sure.
So, yeah, the Electoral Reform Coalition.
It was a coalition. It was a number of interest groups, activists, people who knew and believed that we could do better than we were doing under first past the post. It was around, certainly in the 1980s. Throughout the 1970s we had small parties in New Zealand who the votes for those parties represent or indicated that there were interests that were not being met, that there were social concerns and issues that weren't being represented within Parliament. Over time, the broad concern, the underlying unhappiness with the first past the post system crystallised, I guess, into the Electoral Reform Coalition, which was an organised lobby that sought to bring all of those strands together, did the research, managed to get the the Royal Commission of Inquiry established. Major pressure went into getting that body set up, and ultimately just kept the whole issue at the forefront in the face of some very well-funded and very powerful opposition, I should say.
You're talking about the I can't remember it. The Telecom New Zealand.
Shirtlift Coalition.
Coalition for.
Yes, I've lost the acronym too now.
Coalition for.
Better Government.
CBG. Coalition
CBG.
for Better Government.
Certainly, that group came up as a response and as a direct response to the success that the ERC was seen to be having. It was seen to be getting traction. It was unexpected, the result of the Royal Commission, to be as radical as it was and as forthright. It was unequivocal that we needed to change, and that NMP was it. Clearly, a lot of vested interests suddenly started paying attention at that point, and saw that the ability to influence politics, even in a relatively corruption-free environment like New Zealand politics is, nevertheless there were ways and means that sectoral interests, could much more readily influence government policy where there were only two parties with any overall capacity to make decisions. Much more difficult when you're having to deal with numerous small parties as well. So certainly the sectoral interests were motivated under that banner. Peter Shirtliff's name is most often associated with it. He was provided the figurehead, the leadership, and presumably a great deal of the funding as well.
Hypothetically, do you believe and I don't know if you'd like to speak for Green Party policies or not but hypothetically, would you do anything to change the effectiveness of MMP? Would you make what reforms would you put forward?
I think the key one, and this was identified by the Electoral Commission, the review of the whole election last time, and indeed over the last two elections, it's about education. The level of understanding of how MMP works, how a voter can use that system to get something like an outcome they want, is still relatively low. I think something like 53% of people can do quite a simple quiz and get most of the questions right. So really the Electoral Commissioner, the CEO of the Electoral Commission, has identified the need for much more and more structured and more better resourced education of voters about our own system. New Zealand has our education system in New Zealand is not obliged to teach people about how our parliamentary, how our political system works. I believe in the US you have civics education.
Actually, we got rid of that in the 1960s, and it's a complaint I'd make as well, that we don't even have the schoolhouse rock, how a bill becomes a law. I don't know if you've seen that.
No.
I guess the school.
Certainly in their first year, I mean, these are a self-selecting group, young people interested in politics. One of the first questions on day one I put to them, who's the head of state and who's the head of government, and what's the difference? A really fundamental question, and often you'd get a significant minority who didn't know. 20-30% of a class wouldn't actually know with confidence who was the head, rather the relative roles and powers of the head of state as opposed to the head of government. And that to me is just it illuminates that huge information gap, education gap in our system here.
Now, I may get this wrong. I believe the head of state is the Queen, represented by the Governor General,
That's it.
and the head of government is the Prime Minister, represented by the Prime Minister.
Yes.
But yeah, a lot of people believe that, and they were surprised when Al Gore won the 2000 election popular vote, but not the Electoral College. And
Yes.
they, and everybody was like, well, how does the Electoral College work? Let me go back, try to find some more questions.
I've got one question.
Oh, yeah.
I understand, and I'll get you to direct your answer to Brian. I understand there was quite a big sort of popular support for education, especially sort of grey power, you know, going around the country, making a real effort to educate people individually about the merits of MMP versus STV. What was your experience of that? Were you part of that, or?
Part of the encouragement for it?
Or the education campaign, yeah. Or were you aware of it at the time?
Yes. I think the answer to that is that any education campaign that was in evidence was very, very low key. It didn't actually get penetration in the same way that the government has recently, in the last few years, is very keen to see New Zealanders more educated, better informed about the Treaty of Waitangi, and has put some resource into that, it must be said, but hasn't really got through to many people. I think the same experience with MMP, that at the initial stages when people were wanting to know, well, what does it mean that I've got 2 votes on election day, there was a level of superficial knowledge was absorbed. People now expect to have 2 votes, and they understand for the most part that the party vote is important, but beyond that there's still very little depth of understanding or knowledge of just what that means.
Now you're on the Greens list, correct?
I was on the Greens list, number 12 on the list last election. The list for the next election has not yet been finalised, but yes, for the minute I'm on the historic list, yes.
So, what is it like to be running for? I don't think the Greens were polling at any time during the 2005 election higher than 10%, and I don't know how much it would have been to bring you in. But what are the roles of people further down the list who are maybe long shots of getting into the list? Not that I'm saying that you're a long shot. I'm just saying, you know, just mathematically.
Oh yes, yes. Many Green members on the list actually don't want to become MPs. They don't want to buy into that lifestyle and be politicians. They're campaigning in order to maximise the Green Party vote. Certainly, arguably within the top 20, there are a lot of people who do want to be MPs and are working hard towards that goal. But people who belong to the Green Party understand that there are multiple ways of serving a given end, without wanting to sound too altruistic about it. The fact that I knew at number 12 it was a long shot for me to be an MP, I'd have been delighted to have been one, but that didn't, I can honestly say, diminish the amount of effort I put into that campaign. The more Green MPs we have in Parliament, the more influence we can have, and that's the ball that we all kept our eye on. That was the outcome that we all were pursuing. The individual success or not is secondary. I can say that quite confidently.
I'm just going through a whole. I got like a whole bunch of questions.
I could suggest another one that we haven't asked.
Oh, sure.
The single greatest benefit and the single greatest drawback of MMP.
Oh yeah. What is the single greatest benefit and the single greatest drawback of MMP?
Greatest benefit, it's made democracy possible in New Zealand in a way that it wasn't before. I mentioned we have one House of Parliament, which meant that 50% plus one in that single House of Parliament gave a party complete control over the legislative agenda. In fact, there was a book written called Unbridled Power, and that's very much what the major party in Parliament have. I guess the drawback of MMP, it's difficult to me to see too many compared with first past the post. It's not an ideal system. There is still a percentage of votes which are wasted, party votes which are cast, but for parties that get less than the 5% threshold and fail to win an electorate seat. It's an imperfect system, but it's measurably better than what we had before and gives a measurably more democratic outcome. We've got much broader representation in Parliament in terms of ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of socio-economic status. Yeah, I'm hard pressed to find major drawbacks with MMP, except to concede it is imperfect, and we haven't yet, as a country, as a constituency, we're not yet utilising the potential of the system, I believe, and that will in part be a function of educating people better about it, and just building up a body of experience. As voters come on board who have only ever known MMP, they're not bothered about a transition, they're simply entering into an electoral system for the first or second time, and we will get increasingly more representative outcomes, I believe.
I have another question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Is there any chance that New Zealand will ever change to a single transferable vote system that you can see in the not too distant future?
I don't see that happening anytime soon. It is an option at the moment for local authorities to choose to run an STV system for that particular local authority. Some have picked that up, but not very many. I frankly don't see much appetite for another significant change in the electoral system anytime soon. I don't think it's particularly on anybody's agenda. The Greens still have an expressed preference for STV because it is fundamentally more democratic, but it's really not something that we believe there's any popular appetite for at this time. So I would think we'd be looking probably in terms of a decade or probably decades before that shift would occur.
Do you think the 1992 and 1993 referendums were more of a vote for MMP or a vote against the two-party system?
Good question. My honest answer would be the vote for MMP was a minority of people who saw the necessity for change, a positive change. The vote against first past the post was about people who were disillusioned, who felt that they'd been cheated, betrayed by the major parties. So on balance, I'd have to concede that it was, in a sense, a negative vote, voting out something which hadn't served people's expectations, rather than a more progressive, forward-thinking, positive vote for something new and different, which would offer new opportunities.
So when you're talking about being betrayed by the major parties, are you talking about Rogernomics?
Primarily, yes. The fact that the Labour Party campaigned in 1984 in a fairly conventional left-wing socialist party, or at least social democrat, and then came in and basically just took their hands off beyond the wildest dreams of the interests of those people who did very well out of the 80s and 90s. Rogernomics was Thatchernomics on steroids, essentially, albeit in a smaller country, but we went further and faster in reforming our economy, our public service, and fundamentally turning our social contract on its head. We did that all in a matter of a few years, and we're still suffering the damage and the negative consequences of that, as well as enjoying some of the benefits.
Is it unusual for countries to change their electoral systems in peacetime?
I believe it is. I can't back that up with any particular knowledge or experience, but yes, it's not something which is done lightly by countries. I think you'd need to look to Europe. Yeah, I'm not well informed on that, frankly.
Do you think the change to MMP could have happened at any other time, before or since, in New Zealand's history?
I suspect not. I think there was a window of opportunity there which opened up, and it was a combination of things. It was about a very strong sense of dissatisfaction within the electorate, even within the small C conservative part of the electorate, people who normally resist change, but they were very unhappy with what had been presented to them politically. There were people active and organised enough to advance an alternative. There was that very unexpected ruling of the Royal Commission. I can't think of an earlier time in New Zealand's history where it could have got traction and succeeded, and frankly, if it hadn't happened then, I think we would still be waiting to get that degree of change.
What about the 1979 and 1982 elections? Or was it 1981?
81, yes.
Oh, was it 1978 then?
Yes, yeah. The election was 78-81. The new government sits in the following year, typically, yes.
That's why I got messed up.
Yeah, normally our election's sort of October, November.
Could you explain a little bit about what happened then?
1981 was one of the most divisive years in New Zealand's history. There was a rugby tour from South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement was very highly organised and mobilised, and for the first time...
Sorry. Helicopter, would you mind waiting? Yeah.
Okay.
Let's cut that.
1981.
Yeah, could you...
Okay.
You were talking about the Springbok tour.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
What happened in 1981 with the Springbok tour?
1981 was incredibly divisive. New Zealanders have had long spiritual attachment to the game of rugby. There was a planned South African tour of New Zealand, which went ahead despite significant social objection. The apartheid regime was still in power in South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement got organised in New Zealand in opposition to the tour. The Prime Minister at the time, Robert Muldoon, the head of the National Party, used that tour, and it polarised the country effectively, and Muldoon used that polarisation to advance the political campaign for the National Party. And I believe to this day that some National Party people even are very uneasy about that. For the first time in modern history anyway, we saw violence in the streets of New Zealand on a significant scale. There were police batons waved, people were quite conservative people who would never dream of breaking the law or indeed being involved in protest actually got out there, and people were beaten, families were split. It caused an enormous damage to New Zealand's social fabric, and at least part of that was driven by the determination of that National Party leader to win that election. It was very cynical, it was very not unprecedented, but certainly unusual in New Zealand's history, political history.
The Labour Party has had 9 years at the Treasury benches since with MMP. Not that there has been a lot of MMP elections so far compared to before that, but before that, they only spent 9 years in power totally since 1949 to 1993. Has there been a shift to the left, or is there something about MMP that would change that? That would make Labour voting more likely, or rather, would make it more likely that Labour would get the Treasury benches with the same level of support.
I have a sense that internationally there's a phenomenon of convergence where the difference between left and right is becoming less apparent. That's certainly true in New Zealand. We've had stable government, we've had the Labour-led governments, as you say, for 9 years. I think that in part reflects Helen Clark's ability to maintain a coalition. National was less good at it. The first coalition, of course, ended badly, National New Zealand First. In part, at least, that must reflect the ability of the individual Prime Minister, Helen Clark, and no doubt her advisors and ministers, to maintain the stability and the integrity of a government, albeit it has got somewhat fragile and shaky on occasion. It could also reflect the fact that we've had relatively a reasonable economic history over those years. The country, in large part at least, has felt prosperous, albeit there have been losers from that in that situation as well. But I really would put that down to good management skills as much as any significant shift to the left in the constituency overall.
Let's see. Do you think MMP or something like it, or STV, would any of these things work in the United States?
In principle, yes. Again, this is someone with only a general overview of how politics works in the US. The fact that you have a federal system where you have a second line of defence, if you like, against bad policy or very partisan policy being pushed through. I believe that a more representational or proportional system could certainly work at a state level and conceivably at a federal level. It would be a more complex shift because of the complexity of the American system. But I could certainly see at the state level that MMP could work very well for the elections for the House of Representatives, both at state and indeed at federal level. There's no logical or theoretical reason why it ought not to work just as well as it has in other countries.
But what about a practical reason? Do you think it would be possible to get the level of support in the public needed?
There would be very powerful interests opposing any significant change, I believe. You've got a larger population, therefore a greater challenge in terms of educating people or forming a coherent leadership group who could drive through the change and to make it popular and to advocate for that change. I think it would be a very long-term project. I believe the Canadians tried recently, at least in Ontario, there was an attempt to get MMP. I think they had a referendum recently which is not looking promising. Indeed, it may have failed. You would have similar problems in the US, I believe, practically, that the two-party system in the US is so deeply entrenched, and there would be so much opposition to any substantive change that I think it would be a long-term and difficult project.
Did you ever, my notes may be wrong on this, but did you ever teach in the United States?
No.
Okay, I got you confused with something else. Okay, so, alright, I think that's pretty much all I've got. What about you, Helen?
No, that sounds really good.
Alright.
Cool.
Well, thank you for helping us
My
out.
pleasure.
Are there any like Green Party posters or logos or anything that maybe we could film?
Oh,
We're also
not here.
we'll be going to the Green Party premises on
Oh, yes,
Thursday
yes.
or so.
In Auckland or in Wellington?
Wellington.
Sure, yeah, they've got banners and all
Yeah.
sorts. We've got it
Cool.
here in Auckland too, but if you go into the Wellington office, then there's no need.
Yeah, cool.
What's
Thanks
your
so
schedule
much.
now? You're off to Wellington today, are you?
We're going to Taupo this evening. We're staying in Taupo.
Taupo.
And then Wellington the day after that. Did we get the release forms?
No.